The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 17b. A Great Affliction, Death in the White House, Chapters from the Secret Service, A Morning Call on the President, Goldwin Smith's Impressions of Lincoln, Other Notable Tributes. Early in 1862 an event occurred which added to the sorrow that seemed to enshroud the life of Lincoln, and afforded a glimpse into the depths of his tender and sorrowful nature. It was the death of his son Willie, a bright and promising boy, to whom his father was devotedly attached. This, says Dr. J.G. Holland, was a new burden, and the visitation which, in his firm faith in Providence, he regarded as providential, was also inexplicable. Why should he, with so many burdens upon him, and with such necessity for solace in his home and his affections, be brought into so tender a trial? It was to him a trial of faith, indeed. A Christian lady of Massachusetts, who was officiating as nurse in one of the hospitals, came in to attend the sick children. She reports that Mr. Lincoln watched with her about the bedside of the sick ones, and that he often walked the room, saying sadly, "This is the hardest trial of my life. Why is it? Why is it?" In the course of conversations with her, he questioned her concerning her situation. She told him she was a widow, and that her husband and 2 children were in heaven, and added that she saw the hand of God in it all, and that she had never loved him so much before as she had since her affliction. "How is that brought about?" inquired Lincoln. "Simply by trusting in God and feeling that he does all things well," she replied. "Did you submit fully under the first loss?" he asked. "No," she answered, "not wholly. But as blow came upon blow, and all were taken, I could and did submit, and was very happy." He responded, "I am glad to hear you say that. Your experience will help me to bear my afflictions." On being assured that many Christians were praying for him on the morning of the funeral, he wiped away the tears that sprang in his eyes, and said, "I am glad to hear that. I want them to pray for me. I need their prayers." As he was going out to the burial, the good lady expressed her sympathy with him. He thanked her gently, and said, "I will try to go to God with my sorrows." A few days afterward she asked him if he could trust God. He replied, "I think I can. I will try. I wish I had that childlike faith you speak of, and I trust he will give it to me." Then he spoke of his mother, whom so many years before he had committed to the dust among the wilds of Indiana. In this hour of his great trial, the memory of her who had held him upon her bosom, and soothed his childish griefs, came back to him with tenderest recollections. "I remember her prayers," said he, "and they have always followed me. They have clung to me all my life." An interesting passage in the secret history of the war at this period is narrated by one of the chief actors, Mr. A.M. Ross, a distinguished ornithologist of Canada, whose contribution embodies also so many interesting details of Lincoln's daily life that it seems worth giving rather fully. A few months after the inauguration of President Lincoln, Mr. Ross received a letter from the Hon. Charles Sumner, requesting him to come to Washington at his earliest convenience. "The day after my arrival in Washington," says Mr. Ross, "I was introduced to the President. Mr. Lincoln received me very cordially, and invited me to dine with him. After dinner he led me to a window distant from the rest of the party, and said, 'Mr. Sumner sent for you at my request. We need a confidential person in Canada to look after our interests, and keep us posted as to the schemes of the Confederates in Canada. You have been strongly recommended to me for the position. Your mission shall be as confidential as you please. No one here but your friend Mr. Sumner and myself shall have any knowledge of your position. Think it over tonight, and if you can accept the mission, come up and see me at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.' When I took my leave of him, he said, 'I hope you will decide to serve us.' The position thus offered was one not suited to my tastes, but as Mr. Lincoln appeared very desirous that I should accept it, I concluded to lay aside my prejudices and accept the responsibilities of the mission. I was also persuaded to this conclusion by the wishes of my friend Mr. Sumner." At 9 o'clock next morning I waited upon the President, and announced my decision. He grasped my hand in a hearty manner, and said, "Thank you, thank you. I am glad of it. You must help us to circumvent the machinations of the rebel agents in Canada. There is no doubt they will use your country as a communicating link with Europe, and also with their friends in New York. It is quite possible, also, that they may make Canada a base from which to harass and annoy our people along the frontier." After a lengthy conversation relative to private matters connected with my mission, I rose to leave, when he said, "I will walk down to Willard's with you. The hotel is on my way to the capital, where I have an engagement at noon." Before we reached the hotel, a man came up to the President and thrust a letter into his hand, at the same time applying for some office in Wisconsin. I saw that the President was offended at the rudeness, for he passed the letter back without looking at it, saying, "No, sir, I am not going to open shop here." This was said in a most emphatic manner, but accompanied by a comical gesture which caused the rejected applicant to smile. As we continued our walk, the President spoke of the annoyances incident to his position, saying, "These office-seekers are a curse to the country. No sooner was my election certain than I became the prey of hundreds of hungry, persistent applicants for office, whose highest ambition is to feed at the government crib." When he bade me good-bye, he said, "Let me hear from you once a week at least." As he turned to leave me, a young army officer stopped him and made some request, to which the President replied with a good deal of humor, "No, I can't do that. I must not interfere. They would scratch my eyes out if I did. You must go to the proper department." Some time later, says Mr. Ross, I again visited Washington. On my arrival there, about midnight, I went direct to the Executive Mansion, and sent my card to the President, who had retired. In a few minutes the porter returned and requested me to accompany him to the President's office, where Mr. Lincoln would shortly join me. The room into which I was ushered was the same in which I had spent several hours with the President on the occasion of my first interview with him. Scattered about the floor and lying open on the table were several military maps and documents, indicating recent use. In a few minutes the President came in and welcomed me in a most friendly manner. I expressed my regret at disturbing him at such an hour. He replied in a good-humored manner, saying, "No, no, you did right. You may waken me up whenever you please. I have slept with one eye open ever since I came to Washington. I never close both, except when an office-seeker is looking for me." I then laid before the President the rebel mail. He carefully examined the address of each letter, making occasional remarks. At length he found one addressed to Franklin Pierce, ex-President of the United States, then residing in New Hampshire, and another to ex-Attorney General Cushing, a resident of Massachusetts. He appeared much surprised, and remarked with a sigh, but without the slightest tone of asperity, "I will have these letters enclosed in official envelopes and sent to these parties." When he had finished examining the addresses, he tied up all those addressed to private individuals, saying, "I won't bother with them, but these look like official letters. I guess I'll go through them now." He then opened them and read their contents, slowly and carefully. While he was thus occupied, I had an excellent opportunity of studying this extraordinary man. A marked change had taken place in his countenance since my first interview with him. He looked much older, and bore traces of having passed through months of painful anxiety and trouble. There was a sad and serious look in his eyes that spoke louder than words of the disappointments, trials, and discouragements he had encountered since the war began. The wrinkles about the eyes and forehead were deeper, the lips were firmer, but indicative of kindness and forbearance. The great struggle had brought out the hidden riches of his noble nature, and developed virtues and capacities which surprised his oldest and most intimate friends. He was simple, but astute. He possessed the rare faculty of seeing things just as they are. He was a just, charitable, and honest man. When Mr. Lincoln finished reading the letters, I rose to go, saying that I would go to Willard's and have a rest. "No, no," said the President. "It is now 3 o'clock. You shall stay with me while you are in town. I'll find you a bed." And leading the way, he took me into a bedroom, saying, Take a good sleep. You shall not be disturbed." Bidding me good night, he left the room to go back and pore over the rebel letters until daylight, as he afterwards told me. I did not awaken from my sleep until 11 o'clock in the forenoon, soon after which Mr. Lincoln came into my room and laughingly said, "When you are ready, I'll pilot you down to breakfast," which he did. Seating himself at the table near me, he expressed his fears that trouble was brewing on the New Brunswick border. He said he had gathered further information on that point from the correspondence, which convinced him that such was the case. He was here interrupted by a servant, who handed him a card, upon reading which he rose, saying, "The Secretary of War has received important tidings. I must leave you for the present. Come to my room after breakfast, and we'll talk over this New Brunswick affair." On entering his room again, I found him busily engaged in writing, at the same time repeating in a low voice the words of a poem which I remembered reading many years before. When he stopped writing, I asked him who was the author of that poem. He replied, "I do not know. I have written the verses down from memory at the request of a lady who is much pleased with them." He passed the sheet on which he had written the verses to me, saying, "Have you ever read them?" I replied that I had, many years previously, and that I should be pleased to have a copy of them in his handwriting, when he had time and an inclination for such work. He said, "Well, you may keep that copy if you wish." Hon. William D. Kelly, a member of Congress from Pennsylvania, relates that during the time of McClellan's Peninsular Campaign he called at the White House one morning, and while waiting to see the President, Senator Wilson of Massachusetts entered the chamber, having with him 4 distinguished-looking Englishmen. The President, says Mr. Kelly, had evidently had an early appointment, and had not completed his toilet. He was in slippers, and his pantaloons, when he crossed one knee over the other, disclosed the fact that he wore heavy blue woolen stockings. It was an agreeable surprise to learn that the chief of the visiting party was Professor Goldwin Smith of Canada, one of the firmest of our British friends. As the President rose to greet them, he was the very impersonation of easy dignity, notwithstanding the negligence of his costume. With a tact that never deserted him, he opened the conversation with an inquiry as to the health of his friend John Bright, whom he said he regarded as a friend of our country and of freedom everywhere. The visitors having been seated, the magnitude of recent battles was referred to by Professor Smith as preliminary to the question whether the enormous losses which were so frequently occurring would not so reduce the industrial resources of the North as to affect seriously the prosperity of individual citizens and consequently the revenue of the country. He justified the question by proceeding to recite the number of killed, wounded, and missing, reported after some of the great battles recently fought. There were 2 of Mr. Lincoln's official friends who lived in dread of his little stories. Neither of them was gifted with humor, and both could understand his propositions, which were always distinct and clean-cut, without such familiar illustrations as those in which he so often indulged, and they were chagrined whenever they were compelled to hear him resort to his stories in the presence of distinguished strangers. They were Senator Wilson of Massachusetts and Mr. Stanton, Secretary of War. And as Professor Smith closed his arithmetical statement, the time came for the Massachusetts Senator to bite his lips, for the President, crossing his legs in such a manner as to show that his blue stockings were long as well as thick, said that, in settling such matters as that, we must resort to darky arithmetic. "To darky arithmetic!" exclaimed the dignified representative of the learning and higher thought of Great Britain and her American Dominion. "I did not know, Mr. President, that you have 2 systems of arithmetic." "Oh, yes," said the President. "I will illustrate that point by a little story. 2 young contrabands, as we have learned to call them, were seated together, when one said to the other, 'Jim, do you know 'rithmetic?' Jim answered, 'No. What is 'rithmetic?' 'Well,' said the other, 'it's when you add up things. When you have 1 and 1, and you put them together, they makes 2. And when you subtracts things, when if you have 2 things, and you takes 1 away, only 1 remains. Is dat 'rithmetic?' 'Yeah.' 'Well, 'tain't true, den. It's no good.' Here a dispute arose, when Jim said, 'Now you suppose 3 pigeons sit on that fence, and somebody shoot one of dem. Do t'other two stay dar? I guess not. Dey flies away quicker'n odder feller falls." "And, Professor, trifling as the story seems, it illustrates the arithmetic you must use in estimating the actual losses resulting from our great battles. The statements you have referred to give the killed, wounded, and missing at the first roll call after the battle, which always exhibits a greatly exaggerated total, especially in the column of missing." Mr. Goldwin Smith, the gentleman referred to in the foregoing anecdote, has summarized his impressions of Lincoln in the following paragraph: "Such a person as Abraham Lincoln is quite unknown to our official circles or to those of continental nations. Indeed, I think his place in history will be unique. He has not been trained to diplomacy or administrative affairs, and is in all respects one of the people. But how wonderfully he is endowed and equipped for the performance of the duties of the chief executive officer of the United States at this time. The precision and minuteness of his information on all questions to which we referred was a succession of surprises to me." Still terser, but hardly less expressive, is Emerson's characterization of Lincoln as one who had been permitted to do more for America than any other American man. A striking passage by Mr. Norman Hapgood should have place among these tributes. "Lincoln had no artificial aids. He merely proved the weapon of finest temper in the fire in which he was tested. In the struggle for survival in a national upheaval, he not only proved the living power of integrity and elasticity, but he easily combined with his feats of strength and shrewdness some of the highest flights of taste. As we look back across the changes of his life, see him passing over the high places and the low, and across the long stretches of the prairie, spending years in the Socratic arguments of the tavern, and anon holding the rudder of state in grim silence, choosing jests which have the freshness of earth and principles of eternal right, judging potentates and laborers in the clear light of nature, and at ease with both, alone by virtue of a large and melancholy soul, at home with every man by virtue of love and faith, this figure takes its place high in our minds and hearts, not solely through the natural right of strength and success, but also because his strength is ours, and the success won by him rested on the fundamental purity and health of the popular will of which he was the leader and the servant. Abraham Lincoln was in a deep and lasting sense the first American." Mr. John Bigelow, already quoted in these pages, summarized Lincoln's character and achievements in a passage of singular eloquence and force. "Lincoln's greatness must be sought for in the constituents of his moral nature. He was so modest by nature that he was perfectly content to walk behind any man who wished to walk before him. I do not know that history has made a record of the attainment of any corresponding eminence by any other man who so habitually, so constitutionally, did to others as he would have them do to him. Without any pretensions to religious excellence, from the time he first was brought under the observation of the nation he seemed, like Milton, to have walked as ever in his great taskmaster's eye. St. Paul hardly endured more indignities and buffetings without complaint. He was not a learned man. He was not even one who would deserve to be called in our day an educated man. Knew little rather than much of what the world is proud of. He had never been out of the United States, or seen much of the portion of them lying east of the Alleghany Mountains. But the spiritual side of his nature was so highly organized that it rendered superfluous much of the experience which to most men is indispensable, the choicest prerogative of genius. It lifted him unconsciously above the world, above most of the men who surrounded him, and gave him a wisdom in emergencies which is bestowed only on those who love their fellow man as themselves. In the ordinary sense of the word, Mr. Lincoln was not a statesman. Had he come to power when Van Buren did, or when Cleveland did, he would probably have left Washington at the close of his term as obscure as either of them. The issues presented to the people of the United States at the Presidential election of 1860 were to a larger extent moral questions, humanly speaking, than were those presented at any other Presidential election. They were, first, the right of the majority to rule; second, the right of 8 millions, more or less, of our fellow beings to their freedom; and third, the institutions and traditions which Washington planted and Jefferson watered, with the sacrifices necessary for their preservation. These questions subordinated all other political issues, and appealed more directly and forcibly to the moral sentiments of this nation than any issues they had ever before been called to settle either at the ballot box or by force of arms. A President was needed at Washington to represent these moral forces. Such a President was providentially found in Lincoln, a President who walked by faith and not by sight, who did not rely upon his own compass, but followed a cloud by day and a fire by night, which he had learned to trust implicitly. A very graphic summing up of Lincoln in person and character is that of Mr. John G. Nicolay, one of his private secretaries, who knew him intimately and understood him well. President Lincoln was of unusual stature, 6 feet 4 inches, and of spare but muscular build, says Mr. Nicolay. He had been in youth remarkably strong and skillful in the athletic games of the frontier, where, however, his popularity and recognized impartiality oftener made him an umpire than a champion. He had regular and prepossessing features, dark complexion, broad, high forehead, prominent cheekbones, gray, deep-set eyes, and bushy, black hair, turning to gray at the time of his death. Abstemious in his habits, he possessed great physical endurance. He was almost as tender-hearted as a woman. "I have not willingly planted a thorn in any man's bosom," he was able to say. His patience was inexhaustible. He had naturally a most cheerful and sunny temper, was highly social and sympathetic, loved pleasant conversation, wit, anecdote, and laughter. Beneath this, however, ran an undercurrent of sadness. He was occasionally subject to hours of deep silence and introspection that approached a condition of trance. In manner he was simple, direct, void of the least affectation, and entirely free from awkwardness, oddity, or eccentricity. His mental qualities were a quick analytic perception, strong logical powers, a tenacious memory, a liberal estimate and tolerance of the opinions of others, ready intuition of human nature; and perhaps his most valuable faculty was rare ability to divest himself of all feeling or passion in weighing motives of persons or problems of state. His speech and diction were plain, terse, forcible. Relating anecdotes with appreciating humor and fascinating dramatic skill, he used them freely and effectively in conversation and argument. He loved manliness, truth, and justice. He despised all trickery and selfish greed. In arguments at the bar he was so fair to his opponent that he frequently appeared to concede away his client's case. He was ever ready to take blame on himself and bestow praise on others. "I claim not to have controlled events," he said, "but confess plainly that events have controlled me." The Declaration of Independence was his political chart and inspiration. He acknowledged a universal equality of human rights. "Certainly the negro is not our equal in color," he said, "perhaps not in many other respects. Still, in the right to put into his mouth the bread that his own hands have earned, he is the equal of every other man, white or black." He had unchanging faith in self-government. "The people," he said, "are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution." Yielding and accommodating in non-essentials, he was inflexibly firm in a principle or position deliberately taken. "Let us have faith that right makes might," he said, "and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it."